What's up, everybody? Lindsay, Rhodes, and Sam Bruchhaus with you on the SumerSports show. Coming down the stretch here, just one more week. We have a pretty clear playoff picture. We know what we're looking at. Just a handful of scenarios that we're keeping our eye on in Week 18 that will affect the playoff picture. Aside from seeding, obviously, there's some seeding question marks. Also, we also have an idea about what's going to happen at the top of the draft, and it's not what we thought was going to happen at the top of the draft. Giants, how are Giants fans feeling today? We should have talked to Matt Stopsky, our producer, about that before we started going, because what a game that was yesterday that cost you the number one draft pick. He's weighing in that he feels good, actually.
I feel great.
Okay. He's chiming in. Okay, here we go. He's like, I will jump into this conversation.
I feel good. I feel great. Don't
You're
let me
okay?
down.
You're okay with that one? Okay. I mean, it was an outstanding performance. I mean, do we need to consider Drew Lock to be the starting quarterback? Because you guys, fun fact, I know that the answer is no, and I know that you're about to like lose your mind on me and stuff like that. But this is my favorite stat of the week. We had, and I just kind of gave it away, we had bookended EPA games for quarterbacks this past week. We had the best EPA per dropback game of the year, single game by a quarterback, and the worst EPA per dropback game of the year for a quarterback. Out of the 517 games in this sample size, I think you can guess which one was the best. Now that I just sort of like where in the show I've started telling this story.
Was it Drew Lock of our New York Giants?
Drew Lock plus 1.02. Number one of the entire year. You guys. That's fun. And the worst, care to take a guess?
Was it Aaron Rodgers of our New York Jets?
It was. They were both in New York. How fun. Rodgers minus 1.15.
Listen, man, Drew Lock, franchise quarterback, was in the drafts as I was sitting there in the press box, but did not send tweet. Just was waiting to see more. Excited to see what he can do in Philadelphia.
I am sorry. Best game of the year? What? Drew Lock?
Drew Lock, franchise quarterback. Hard send tweet.
Oh, by the way,
he goes hard for the city.
I had like a dyslexic moment. I said 1.02. It's 1.2. Like it was even better. Like what in the world just happened? Anyway, so now the Patriots are in the driver's seat to have the number one pick. All they have to do is lose this week. They don't have any other tiebreaker that could move a team ahead of them. They play the Bills. They'll find a way to get that done, I'm sure. Anyway, so lots of interesting things happened this past week that set the table for an interesting week and weeks ahead, I guess. Sam, what stands out to you?
The Sunday night football game stood out to me as having long-term implications. I think it settled the fact that Jaden Daniels is a player who you can build an offense around. And we haven't seen a ton of rookie quarterbacks in, past years who have been able to do that in year one. I think Justin Herbert had a season like that. But even you look at the top of the list, Patrick Mahomes didn't play his first year. And even guys like Russell Wilson and all the way back to Tom Brady, like needed some pulling along at the time of their rookie season. Jaden Daniels has the ability to change the face of a game all by himself using his precise, accurate passing and his legs. Flip to the other side of the Falcons. I think that Michael Penix is probably the answer for them going forward. I really like the pace at which he threw the ball. He was pretty efficient. Not as efficient as I would have wanted to see given his depth of target increasing. I know we talked about that a lot last week. But overall, it was really exciting. I think it has long-term implications for both teams. And also, in particular for the Commanders, has some sights on the playoffs.
Okay, this is, in some ways, neither here nor there, but also was somewhat confusing to me. And it does stem from probably fantasy production. But I think that points us to usage and just how this could happen. Like what happened with Terry McLaurin? In the bigger picture from just a real football standpoint, obviously the gravity of Terry McLaurin maybe opens things up for other people. And you've got guys that are making plays and stuff, but that it's weird to me that you could end up in a game like that where Terry McLaurin has a catch. And I'm curious about what you saw in that regard.
I think you have ID'd it early on in the season is they kind of take the approach that I'd say the Steelers take the approach on defense with TJ Watt, where it's like, where Terry McLaurin is going to be. We're going to game plan for everything else. Yesterday's game plan heavily featured Olamide Zaccheaus. There were points in the game where I was thinking to myself, is Olamide Zaccheaus a true number 2 gadget wide receiver? Just because of how he was playing and how they were using him. And then down the stretch, it featured Zach Ertz really, really heavily. Yeah. And I think that's kind of going to be Cliff Kingsbury's approach going into the playoffs is Terry is going to be there. He's going to be on one side. You're going to have to devote a player to him, or else we're going to get those long balls that we saw earlier in the season with Jaden and Terry McLaurin. You're probably going to have to devote a safety to him as well. But we're going to play off of that, knowing that's what you're going to have to be doing. And we're going to mix in gap scheme runs, exotic runs with guys like Zaccheaus, and we're going to attack you with multiple tight end sets, which is something they've been very successful at all year as well.
Yeah, Zach Ertz made $750,000 in incentives in overtime last night. Tipped his receptions number, his yards, and his touchdown, apparently. So that was a very, very lucrative extra period for him. Still waiting for my Ben Sinnott breakout year, I guess. I didn't necessarily think that. Is it going to be like a Trey McBride thing, almost like specifically with sitting behind Zach Ertz and then wait now?
Right. Perhaps with tight ends, we typically see the draft curve be a little bit later anyway. And I think that they use so many Bates plays a lot. He had a catch or two yesterday as well for the Commanders. But I think that Sinnott is an effective blocker. And if you can be an effective blocker in a run first offense, which that's been who the Commanders are this year, you're going to get more and more reps. So I'd expect year 2 and year 3 Sinnott to play a large part, especially given that Ertz was more of a stopgap anyway to begin with.
We have somebody in the comments here, Daniel Buffenmeyer, who says that he started Ertz over Chig in fantasy. And that was a really good call because Chig has been very good the last few weeks. And I would have probably said start Chig over Ertz under the circumstances. And then Ertz was tied in too. That's a different conversation. That's a fantasy related conversation. But he also points out that AJ Terrell is what happened to Drake London. But the point is, it shouldn't be that easy. That's always been my point,
good point,
right? Like if you do move people around, you shouldn't be able to just take somebody out of a game, like
right.
Pat Surtain against Jamar Chase. Like you're going to hit, you're going to miss, right? Because Jamar Chase is a very extreme example who's going to beat you, more frequently, I suppose. But like you should be able to move away from that guy. Like it shouldn't just be locked down. There are examples right and left of why that should be harder. I've been waiting. As I'm sure everyone who knows me will be shocked to find out, I've been waiting for the next gen route chart to come out about Terry McLaurin so I can see how locked down he was, because more frequently in the last few weeks, he has moved around. So I don't know. I can't remember, how much he was moving around yesterday.
Right. It's interesting. And this probably leads us to a different conversation across the landscape of the NFL, but it's interesting to me, the class of wide receivers that have kind of cropped up, because you have, as you mentioned, your Jamar Chase, your Justin Jeffersons of the world, who you either have to devote everything on your defense to stop them, which it seemed like the Green Bay Packers were trying to do to a certain degree for Justin Jefferson yesterday.
Yep.
I think Nico Collins is probably in that now. AJ Brown, no one's really been able to stop. But then there's this second direct number 2 tier that I think includes Terry McLaurin, and I think it may include Garrett Wilson with the Jets, and it may include some other players that are certified number 1 wide receivers, but they can't win games all by themselves for you.
Well, that is an interesting point, and it does bring me, since you brought up Garrett Wilson's name, to a report yesterday that we heard in the pregame on NFL Network. Ian Rappaport was talking about the Jets and how things haven't gone their way this year as expected, and kind of raised the possibility of Garrett Wilson maybe being elsewhere next year, and this being an interesting offseason in that regard. he essentially was saying it could be Rodgers or Garrett Wilson, right? Like, will Garrett Wilson be in their plans? He did not click with Aaron Rodgers. If they choose to go back to Aaron Rodgers, then does Garrett Wilson ask for a trade? Like, are we looking at an either or situation here? Not knowing whether we actually are, but that being kind of an idea that's been floated. How do you think the Jets should go about making that particular decision, if that is something that it comes down to, him or him?
I think the Jets' hole is at quarterback.
Yeah, me too.
And it's really shocking. You mentioned how unexpected the season was. This is really how unexpected it was. Depending on how you look at it, if you look at open or close of the lines, they were favored in anywhere between 9 and 14 games this year, which is outrageous. So basically Vegas, and the grand consensus of everyone putting money, thinks that this is a winning team. And so we have to go through, the lines, the analytics and everything, and try to figure out what's wrong with this team. We did our Pro Bowl voting. They received Pro Bowl votes at wide receiver, at some of the offensive line positions, at multiple of the defensive line positions, outside linebacker, cornerback, you name it. They had players that performed really well. So there's no other really place to go. In terms of Garrett Wilson himself, I do think he's in a kind of a second tier of wide receivers, even though he's a certified wide receiver 1. But I can tell you who's not in tier 1 or tier 2, period, and that's Aaron Rodgers this year.
Yeah, it's been wild watching him this year. Not as wild, I think, for like, there were some of us that went into the season in a camp of like, I don't know, like I never bought into the whole, they have Aaron Rodgers and so Super Bowl or bust, which kind of became the narrative when he first went there. Then he got hurt. Obviously that's a failure of a season, or like, they're just a mess. And then this year we just reverted right back to our expectations that we had when Aaron Rodgers came in originally. And to a degree, look at the roster, and the roster does look pretty good at some key spots. Like, it's not a perfect roster by any means, but we thought it was going to be a lot better than it actually ended up being. Because his last year in Green Bay was so not good, and I know that people point to, well, he had some young wide receivers, and certainly that changes the calculus of everything, right? If you're not on the same page, but there were a lot of examples that we could point to in that last year in Green Bay where you could just watch it and go, that was him. That one's on him. That one might not have been on him. That one was on him. You can go through it and you could have figured out that last year, like, he don't look like himself this year. He doesn't look like the guy that we are going to put into the Hall of Fame the first time that his name's on a ballot, unless he keeps talking on podcasts and people don't like him enough that they don't vote for him. But I doubt that that'll be the case, and I digress. Anyway, it's been really bad this year, statistically speaking, in terms of like the Sumer grades, the AI grades, the information that we have. How bad has it been? Like, what are we talking about in terms of comparative, numbers, him to other people in other seasons?
It's been pretty staggeringly bad. He's solidly in the bottom quarter of quarterbacks that have played in the range that we have applied artificial intelligence to. So it's not good.
Which is 2018, right? It goes back about 6 years. Okay.
Right. That's correct. And so you're trying to do the repo of it to a certain degree. And you look back at his final season in Green Bay, and that's about where he was. And the whole formula of this entire Jets season was, can we get average play from Aaron Rodgers? Because that would be an upgrade from Zach Wilson and Mike White and all these other folks that they trotted out at quarterback over the years. And the answer resoundingly was no. And moreover, the answer resoundingly was, it's no different than the last year in Green Bay. And I don't know how you can look at the last 3 years, including the Achilles injury, and make the call of, we're going to go with the roster that we feel is good and with players who performed well this year, and allow ourselves to fall into this trap. Again, despite some of the numbers on the face in context of the Jets' putrid offenses of the past looking okay.
Well, and okay, so I mean, and honestly, none of this is new to people who have listened to our show. We have been consistent about, hey guys, Aaron is a problem. He's not playing well. It's not just environmental. It's not, there's stuff going on that is specifically about him. What about the Garrett Wilson part? Like where you talked about like the tier. Okay. So let's talk about what that actually means, because so reception perception had Garrett Wilson coming off of last year in the 96th percentile versus man, 93rd percentile versus press. These are really, really good numbers. Where does Sumer have him this year?
Ours diverges a little bit, and I think there is an understanding that the film or the charting may have of what is occurring to a player. We look more at the situation agnostic and trying to understand the interplay between the wide receivers and the cornerbacks and the coverage as compared to every historical play in the AI. And we have him more kind of in that 15 to 20 range of wide receivers, which is good.
Like in terms of ranking, right?
Correct.
Like not percentile, but like round. Okay.
Correct. In terms of ranking. So that would be something like, the mid 80th percentile. And so again, he's a certified wide receiver 1. He's just not a guy who's going to be a player who can get a victory all by himself like a CeeDee Lamb can. The core problem with his game is he just has not been a yards after catch guy throughout his career. And I think when you're looking at someone that you need to really pick up an entire offense, you need a guy like Tyreek Hill or a guy like Jamar Chase who is extremely active in breaking tackles and creating yards by himself so that you can get him the ball a little bit earlier. I think that probably hurts his relationship with Aaron Rodgers a little bit too, because Aaron Rodgers is a guy who wants to get the ball out really, really quick, given his age and given his profile kind of over his career as well. And when you're not able to generate stuff past that, it limits you to the intermediate and deep shots that Aaron Rodgers just apparently doesn't have anymore.
Have you watched the documentary Enigma?
I have not. So this is whatever you're about to say is going to be fascinating to me.
Well, so I'm not done with it. I'm like, it's a slow drip, man. I'm like putting it on for a chunk of time and then kids come home and I turn it off. And so we're like doing this in stages. I've been live posting thoughts that I have on Blue Sky on a thread. But it's fascinating because there's some of the things that he's acknowledging. He's kind of talking about, like, for instance, with regards to the football stuff, we all know that in the last few years, he is a guy who consistently looks frustrated towards the person that maybe just didn't do something. Like there was a play this weekend where he clearly botched the throw and then like does the whole like, oh gosh, and you're just like, I mean, that kind of looked like you to me, but
right.
But he acknowledges that in the documentary that a lot of those types of moments are not really about the other person failing. It's almost like, it talks a lot about how he's a perfectionist and how he's trying to like rid himself of that kind of, expectation on himself. And he said that that's a reflection of that. It's like a frustration with the inability to be perfect. And to me, that feels like an insecurity, right? Like when you're afraid that people are going to think that you weren't perfect, then you kind of go and you try and place it somewhere else. And so it feels like a maturity situation. But what I thought was interesting about it is that he literally talks about this in the documentary, which happened last offseason. And then this season, we're seeing the exact same things happen. So there's a self-awareness that he does this. There is a desire to not want to do this. But he just hasn't been able to break through in that particular area of leadership.
I think there's probably another element too, where the attention to detail that is necessary to succeed for 20 years in the NFL is so extremely high. And when you as a quarterback physically cannot do it, but probably in his head, he is doing it. It's probably immensely, immensely frustrating. I mean, I've had to come back from major injuries before back when I was playing, and it definitely is a struggle when you can't, do the same things that you used to. And it's now 2 years going on that he hasn't been able to put it together. And I can imagine that can be immensely frustrating.
Well, I would imagine too, it's hard to acknowledge. Like when you are kind of a merit-based perfectionist, like I'm going to work hard and I'm going to accomplish this, like, when you just physically can't. I think you're right that's probably hard for him to figure out. One of the things, just following up about the Jets, though, is their defense we thought was going to be a relative strength going into the season, particularly the pass defense. You've got Sauce Gardner. This is great. Their defense has the worst drop back EPA score since week 10 in the entire NFL. I thought that was wild, because if you were just to say like, okay, I've got an offense, like let's say in fantasy, and you're trying to figure out matchups and you're not really looking at the numbers. You're like, well, I don't know. That guy is going up against Sauce. That might be a tough matchup. Like, you think of the Jets defense in terms of like passing assets going against them as being a relatively tough matchup, and not at all the case. The dead last in the NFL since week 10. So they've got a lot of things to figure out. And certainly part of this is like, when the offense, when it's not working on the offense, that affects the defense. When it's not working on the defense, it affects the offense. Like, all of it kind of, you bring each other down to a degree. And we see examples of that all over the place. But I thought that was fascinating. Also fascinating how good Tampa Bay's defense has been as of late. Because, and we talked about this last week, but it's continued. They have the best rush defense in rush EPA since week 10. Number 1. They are 7th in EPA per play in that 8-week time frame. And I'm kind of looking at them and thinking Tampa Bay was a team that I was looking at in terms of the playoff picture and thinking that they were more exciting than Atlanta, and largely just because they have the offense. Like, they have an offense that can maybe keep up and outscore another offense, but that the defense was definitely going to give up points. If the defense doesn't give up points, if the defense is actually getting better as the season goes on, Tampa becomes a much more interesting playoff contender in my mind.
Tampa, I think, has the luxury of having 2 good cornerbacks. And when you have Jamel Dean and you have Zion McCollum out there, who, Zion McCollum's kind of a riser through this season, and you're basically cutting the perimeter off, it allows everyone in the middle to do their job more properly. And we've seen that in the AI grades early on in the season. Levante David was not doing that fantastically. Now he's pretty solidly above average. That's a veteran guy who has his job. And then Vita Vea is a monster in the middle. So I think they have these kind of standpoints at the far perimeter, deep in the middle, where you have to pick and choose where you attack this Tampa defense. And given that you're having to pick and choose that with kind of what's become a very complimentary offense, running and passing, with Bucky Irvin and Mike Evans and Baker slinging the ball everywhere, it becomes a real challenge for offenses to keep up with. I do think they have benefited from their schedule a little bit, but week over week, you're playing NFL teams and you're stringing together victories, you're stringing together good games. At some point, it becomes your identity.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think you're right to point out the schedule has certainly helped them in regard to some of these stats, but like, I think there's something to be said for the fact that they're at least consistently still performing the way that they should against lesser teams. And if they were as bad as they were earlier in the season, I think that there would be more inconsistency that would go along with that. Some other defensive stats that popped out to me that I think are interesting to note for the playoffs. Cincinnati is 25th in EPA per play since week 10. We all know that Cincinnati's defense is bad, right? So that's neither here nor there, but they're that's what we're looking at if they get into the postseason. The Steelers' run defense is 25th. Again, I'm just looking at the last 8-game sample size, like down the stretch. It feels like it's more than a month. It's a pretty big sample, but like shows a pattern of like where we actually are going into the postseason. The Steelers being 25th in rush EPA, I thought was shocking. And Pittsburgh's offense is 26th in EPA per play with a success rate that ranks 29th. They are 5 percentage points lower in that statistical category than New England in terms of success rate. 30% success rate, I believe, like New England, just to throw a name out there of an offense that nobody is excited about. They have a success rate of 35%. So my point saying all of this is the Steelers, and again, that's just their rush defense, but if the defense isn't a strength and the offense isn't a strength, then like, what are we looking at here with Pittsburgh going into the postseason?
flipping back from the Tampa conversation, I think they have a little bit of a schedule bug as well, but it's the teams they're going to face in the playoffs. They've played in the last 3 weeks, Philly, Baltimore, Kansas City, all three absolutely elite rushing teams, or Kansas City, obviously less so by the numbers, but we know that they want to run the ball and they're going to be highly successful at that. And they've struggled all years with their corners tackling. It's kind of the flip side of the Bucks to a certain degree. And when you have guys like Derrick Henry that you have to tackle, they were on the outside, and Saquon Barkley and the running backs that the Chiefs have, and even they played Cincinnati, I think 4 or 5 weeks ago. Chase Brown out there, it becomes really difficult for those defensive ends, particularly given the way that they like to play their defensive ends. TJ Watt and Highsmith out there as kind of more pinning their ears back, playing the pass. It gets really difficult for those guys to play. And I think they just kind of have to bit and piece it together on the defensive side of the ball to make up for the offensive issues. And when you're playing teams like Philly, Baltimore, KC, you can't really make mistakes on the defensive side of the ball because they will take advantage of them. And so all that to say, this is who the Steelers are, I think. I think this is who the Steelers will continue to be, because we've seen how recently they performed against this level of talent. And I don't know how we can extrapolate that from anything else.
Yeah. I mean, they didn't have George Pickens for some of those games, so that changes things pretty dramatically for them, as we've seen. But even that said, I feel like they're a team that I don't know that I'm optimistic that this is a year for a deep run. However, where they are in terms of seeding might actually kind of extend their season. So we were looking at this week and the different scenarios, and there's been some conversation about the fact that the Steelers could rest their starters if the Ravens win, because they both play on Saturday. So the Ravens play in the early game, the Steelers are in the later game. The division's not yet decided. So on the surface, they'd both like to win, but since Baltimore goes first and they have the edge, the Ravens could wrap up the division by the time the Steelers take the field. In which case, do the Steelers rest their starters? Okay, that's a conversation that will be entertained this week. In my opinion, the Steelers desperately want to hang on to 5, in my opinion, because the difference between having the 5 seed and the 6 seed is wild this year. The 4 seed is Houston. Houston, just for context, I rattled off some Steelers stats. Houston, dead last in the NFL in success rate offensively since week 10. Wait, is that their defense or their no, that's obviously their offense. Yeah. So Houston is, I'm offensively just going through it. CJ Stroud, this is a separate conversation. Now I'm jumping all over the place, is a guy that we're going to have to discuss in the offseason, because he is at the bottom of every quarterback list for the year. I mean, he's had a terrible, terrible season to follow up a season where we were like, well, they nailed it, with that pick, and had all the conversations about how like the Panthers had blown it with Bryce Young when they could have had CJ Stroud. And now it's starting to look like, I don't totally know that for sure, that what we thought was true is true. Regardless, back to the point of this, which is that the Texans are going to be the 4. So if the Texans are the 4, that means whoever is the 5 plays them. Right. That is absolutely the matchup that you want in the first round of the playoffs.
Definitely.
Absolutely. So if Pittsburgh gets the 5 seed and is able to stave off the Chargers with a win, then they could absolutely get out of the wild card round, and then play in the next round, where, I mean, who knows who they would play in the next round, but yeah, I don't know. This is going to be a fascinating one, because I think that you could be looking at Pittsburgh getting a win in the postseason, despite the fact that I don't think that they're very good.
I think the key with Houston is they are not good when CJ Stroud is pressured. He's like the 9th worst player by our count, by SumerSports count, which you can catch on SumerSports.com. Data quarterback when pressured, and he gets pressured a lot. Like the offensive line is not good outside of Laramie Tunsil.
Yep.
like must fix it in the offseason. I think this is just more of a sophomore slump for CJ Stroud, given what we saw last year. I think they're going to probably reinvest in the offensive line, get a little better of a running game for Joe Mixon getting going. But who better to pressure them than those two guys I just mentioned, Highsmith and TJ Watt? Like, if you feel confident that you can get pressure on CJ Stroud, that is the matchup you want. And I think there's a lot of teams in the playoffs that are pretty confident that they can get pressure on CJ Stroud. And so I think that's the direction you have to be fighting for. I think it sets up for an interesting week 18.
Yeah. So if you get the 5 seed, you play Houston. If
Right.
you get the 6 seed, you are playing Baltimore, unless Baltimore. I mean, this is the scenario where we're talking about if Baltimore wins on Saturday, and then they lock that 3 seed up. If they don't, then the whole Pittsburgh conversation flips because they could be the 3. But point being, that you don't want that matchup.
Baltimore is not a
huge
matchup
disparity.
you want right now.
That's a huge disparity in matchup.
Quietly, Baltimore's defense is like sneaking into the top 10 on EPA per play at the end of the season. Yeah. Like they're sneaking up there. They're still not great in the aggregate in the pass, but the move to put Kyle Hamilton as a deep safety, which is crazy because Kyle Hamilton is 6'4", 225 pounds. Like
he's a
big
stud.
dog back there.
He is a stud. I love watching him play. The number of times when you watch Baltimore and like that he's going to be flying around making plays and his name is going to be one that you're aware of is he's awesome.
Yeah.
The Bengals and the Dolphins are still in this mix.
The poor Dolphins,
AFC,
man.
And the Broncos. So the Broncos are in the 7 seed right now. The Dolphins are in 8 since he's in 9. So here's how it looks for this week. Okay. The Chiefs versus the Broncos. If the Broncos win, then they're in and it's done for Miami and Cincinnati. All Denver has to do is win that game. If the Broncos lose to the Chiefs, who are going to be resting starters, the Dolphins can get in if they beat the Jets. And that will be one of 5 games in the late window. That'll take place at the same time as the Broncos game. So they'll have to play everybody, which the NFL obviously wants to incentivize people to do in this week as much as possible. The Bengals can only get in if the Broncos and the Dolphins lose. And then they also have to beat the Steelers. And they will play Saturday night at 8 p.m. Eastern so that they don't know the results of those other 2 games. And they're going to have to, go for it and try to get it. So those will make for some very interesting games, I think, this weekend.
It's so interesting, Lindsay, because we talk about, they're resting their starters, they're tanking this game. And obviously the Chiefs will be resting their starters. But this is probably a big, huge game for Carson Wentz's career if he's going to be the one starting in this game for the Chiefs. And you try to get that film out. Who knows if Carson Wentz can't be the next Sam Darnold. Obviously, we saw him in a Colts uniform and it didn't look great, but it's big for these guys who are on the borderline to put up good film, especially against a quality playoff team and a quality defense like the Denver Broncos. And so those guys are going to be going all out, even though it may not be the highest level of talent, the Patrick Mahomes level of talent against the Broncos. And any game against the Chiefs is a scary game.
Well, that's an interesting point too, just across the board too, because when we talk about resting starters, there's only a certain number of starters that you can afford to rest.
Right.
Like just in terms of like the numbers game of it all. So it's not like every starter is coming off the field. You're going to see a lot of starters. You're just going to have a handful that are protected, I think, for that game.
Certainly.
So that's something to keep in mind also. The Vikings-Lions game next week.
I'm very excited.
Sunday Night Football for the division and the 1 seed. Loser falls to 5 and plays the NFC South winner. That's I mean, the NFL couldn't have picked a better game to close out the regular season than that one. That'll be amazing.
Absolutely not. These are 2 houses of teams, which there were deliberate flaws in the Vikings, and then there's the deliberate flaw of the Lions that their whole defense is hurt. And they've just been able to overcome them week over week over week. And the Vikings, it ended up being close, but for much of that game, they dismantled the Packers. And it came down basically to the fact, and I think they discussed this a little bit in the presser today, of you just can't really play man against the Vikings offense because you can't guard Addison and Hawkinson and Jefferson and even Jalen Naylor at this point, while also stopping Aaron Jones. Sam Darnold was able to pick them apart. And if that's going to be the case on offense, the defense can just kind of chug along, but the defense has been their strength all year. So it's really interesting. They're certainly ascending and peaking at the right time. But the team that can blow that all up is the Lions, whose offense is an absolute supernova that no one can stop, period. So
Yeah.
I'm hoping for a high-scoring game, but I could definitely see how this one gets muddied up, despite these two teams having, pretty good players on defense, less so the Lions right now, but Branch and those guys will be running around, certainly.
Yeah, and I mean, we haven't even seen the Lions at the time that we're having this conversation. We haven't seen them play in week 17. They've got San Francisco. The game doesn't necessarily mean that much for them anymore. Under the circumstances, it'll all come down to next week anyway, but I'm assuming that we will see Dan Campbell put his guys out there and still try to win the game. That would feel very unlike them, I think, not to.
Certainly.
So that would be a risky thing. In terms of the NFC South, we've got the Falcons hosting the Panthers in the early window and the Bucks hosting the Saints in the early window. The NFC South, whoever wins the division, Bucks are sitting in the driver's seat. So if they win, that one's done. They're the only ones that control their destiny here. Who has the better matchup? Like, is this they're both winnable games. Bucks versus Saints, Falcons versus Panthers.
The Panthers have shown the ability to compete. I mean, they competed against a fully healthy Chiefs team this year. So I am inclined to believe that if Derek Carr doesn't play, that's a Buccaneers victory off top. So if I was a betting man, which I am not, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, whatever way you want to play it, I'd put my money on the Buccaneers, just because who knows what can happen with the Panthers. We've seen them play well this year. They have a pretty strong running game, strong interior offensive line, and those young wide receivers can hook up with Bryce Young at any time. The Saints are pretty grim. There's not a lot of guys that are going to be trotting out that are top talent on that Saints team. So my money's on the Bucs here.
Going back to the Vikings and the two teams that we were talking about for the NFC 1 seed, I think we need to talk about Sam Darnold. To a degree, this feels like a conversation that we're having a little bit early. I mean, it's always fun to have it, I guess. I think my opinion is that the whole Sam Darnold Minnesota future conversation will largely depend on what happens in the playoffs and how that goes with the last taste is in everybody's mouth. Like if they don't win the Super Bowl, but the game that they lose is Sam Darnold playing well and they're competitive, then that's one thing. Does he turn the ball over a couple of times in that game? And that's why they lose the game. I mean, there's been no pattern that suggests that that's what's likely to happen. And I don't even know if that did happen in the last game, if it would be fair to have a conversation about him in that way, to overweight that after the entire season's worth of data that we have on him in that offense. But I do wonder what you're thinking in terms of like whether the Vikings have to bring him back now. I mean, they've been so successful and nobody's saying it's because of Darnold, but he's certainly playing well enough for him to get part of the credit, right? Like we all acknowledge that there's an environment situation that's happening that he probably needs to be in place, but it is in place. So if it continues to be in place, Darnold has at least proven that he can take you wherever you want to go. I mean, at this point, like they are in line for the 1 seed with Sam Darnold,
right?
So you have to at least consider not upsetting the apple cart here and bringing him back and just riding this one, kind of like in a Jared Goff sort of way, maybe, right? Like, is it because of Jared Goff, or is Jared Goff having success and that's enough for what the Lions, the position that they're going to put him in? I wonder if the two are similar to a degree.
Yeah, I think you take a 3-pronged approach here. Number one, does the coach trust him? It certainly seems to be the case. He's being asked to make capital T throws on a week-by-week basis against good defenses. The Packers defense has been one that can generate turnovers all year. They did generate one on a poor throw from Darnold, but he was driving the ball over the middle in clutch moments in a way that showed that KOC does truly trust him. The second you look at the analytics, he's been fantastic over the course of the year in the analytics. He's one of the top players in terms of our all-in-one metric. He's been fairly accurate. And then you try to evaluate those problems, see if they match up with the film. He's not ideal in timing. And I do think we see that pop up on the film. I think it happened in the pick. He had a great drive, 20 yards down the field to convert a third down. That was a little off kilter. His wide receiver was able to make the catch. If that's even a millisecond shorter, I think that ends up being a pick too. I think that needs to be improved, but I don't think that's a massive issue, particularly when you're dealing with wide receivers, as we mentioned, that are as talented as Addison and Jefferson. And then he just takes a lot of sacks, which problematic, but we've seen people overcome that. Joe Burrow is one of those guys who also isn't great at avoiding sacks, but is able to be productive. And so all three of those marry up. It seems like you kind of got to bring them back. It just matters at what number. The number is rising week by week. I think if I'm Darnold's agent, Jared Goff at $53 million is sticking out to me like a neon sign. And then if I'm the team, I want to keep it as close to that Baker deal as possible, given it was a very similar, kind of chop up
Remind me, Baker's
position. I think Baker's like $33 million a year. So you do have about it's a very similar situation as the Brock Purdy thing, except I think Brock Purdy has a little bit more of a resume and a pedigree, but you're dealing in like a $22 million deal space, which you can try to get to with incentives and all this other stuff, but it's difficult to cover up that $22 million. I'm inclined to believe that they'll bring him back no matter what occurs.
Oof. I feel like it's interesting that you gave that specific range, because I land right in the middle. Like the number that just pops into my head for no other reason than it just sounds like the right rough number is 40 for him. We'll split the difference, because I think you could make the argument, if you're the team, that and it's neither here nor there if Sam's representation doesn't want to hear it, but I think you could argue Jared, even when Jared wasn't like outstanding individually, like his team was still winning. He wasn't
made a Super Bowl.
Exactly. So the Rams could win with Jared. Jared never had like just a full like bust attached to him. Right. We never went through that. Sam has had legitimately bad seasons. In bad environments, and we've beat this into the ground, but like in Carolina and New York, I mean, like we've traveled and had it not work out in multiple stops. So I think you can definitely make a solid argument for why he should come in under Jared, because I think that there's more risk attached to him than there ever was attached to Jared. And I also think that, I've said this before. I think that Sam's representation is going to be incentivized to want to stay in Minnesota, because I don't know if he's somebody that goes, okay, if you don't pay me, then I'll go to fill in the blank of other team looking for quarterback that's terrible, right? Pick one and go, they need a new line. They need new pass catchers. They need new whatever, like that. You're not going to find a situation that is as attractive. So are you going to split hairs and go, no, I need $10 more million a year when you're already paying me 40? Like at a certain point, I just think Sam Darnold is the perfect storm of a guy who's going to go, that's enough. I'm here, just so it's a number that doesn't feel disrespectful. And I feel like I'm a little bit taken care of. I think I would be shocked if they were like, nope, biggest bag. That's what we're looking for.
The interconnection between the Darnold and Purdy talks is going to be really interesting this summer, because I think if Purdy gets the bag, $65 million, this becomes a very, very easy decision for the Vikings. You give him $40 million, you're about at half of what the top of the market is, or slightly over that, and you feel happy about where the market is probably going in the future. If the top of the quarterback market does stall and there is a fight over the Purdy contract and all this, these are two players that are playing pretty similarly this year. One on a very successful team, one on a less successful team, with different pedigrees, but similar kind of MOs, at least this year. And so last year, it felt like the quarterback market was cut and dry. Jared Goff was going to play well because he had played well as you mentioned, he had the resume and he was on the most active offense in the league. The guys like Trevor Lawrence and all that needed to be paid highly because they had received MVP votes, blah, 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 blah. This is very unclear. This is like uncharted territory, especially given JJ McCarthy, if he stayed another year, would probably be considered the best quarterback in this draft. And the Vikings have him as their number 2. So there's all kind of things in motion at the same time in a quarterback hungry league where that's the most important position, but there's this massive chunk of money that has now had to go to the quarterbacks, and we'll see how some of them approach it. I'm inclined to not extend Purdy this year. I'm inclined to do what it takes, at least in the short term, to keep Darnold in Vikings uniform just because of how well he's looked, and set it up for McCarthy to come in at some point, given he's healthy, given give another year of eval on that knee and how he looks really getting reps. But who knows how they approach it.
Mia Kimes floated the idea of trading JJ. Like, are we at that stage? She specifically said, like, hey, to the Giants. And I don't know if that was, a serious or just like a, hey, let's talk about this. Are we at this stage now where we're talking about moving JJ because we don't need him yet, and you can go back and draft a quarterback later down the road, like when you feel like you are there and you're running out of room for Sam Darnold? I don't know.
I don't know if if I'm not mistaken, the Giants had the opportunity to pick a quarterback last year and they didn't do it. And so that tells me less about what the quarterback situation was there and more about their evaluation of those quarterbacks. And I don't think your evaluation of Michael Penix or Bo Nix or JJ McCarthy has really changed since then. And if anything, it's gone down. What I'm looking for is a team that loved JJ McCarthy and just couldn't get to the spot to get him as someone who may swoop in. And I don't really have one. Like, the Jets come to mind given the upheaval. Like, you just try to throw a dart in there. They ended up with like Olu Fashanu. I can't remember exactly. I think he went like a pick behind or something like that, if I'm not mistaken. But evaluations differ, and my evaluation of JJ McCarthy was like a Desmond Ridder plus, a guy who has a little bit of athleticism and a little bit of an arm, but it just has to be put all together in the right place. There's no better place than Minnesota, but at this point, you kind of got to stick with what you have, and what you have right now is a guy who's performing as one of the best quarterbacks in the league, and Sam Darnold.
Also, if that's the evaluation, and I'm not saying that's their evaluation, but if that's the way they see it too, right? Like, then what you have that
right
with an example of success. Like, that what you have that also checks exactly that same box is successful. So why would you move against that? I mean, financially, there's reasons to move away to a rookie quarterback and get on that deal, but that feels very, very risky. It also feels risky to me to trade JJ.
Yep.
Because if you have that guy in waiting, and then next year, for whatever reason, Sam doesn't look the way he did this year, then you're not back at square one looking for a quarterback again. I suppose you kind of have that in place, and you're developing JJ as much as you can develop a quarterback who's not getting starters reps, that week in practice. But we've seen guys who have sat on the bench come in and have some success. And so maybe you're arguing that's the upside there. But also, if you could trade him and get something back, there are a lot of people who are looking for quarterbacks this year, and I don't think it's a particularly great quarterback draft. Like you said, if JJ had stayed, would he be the number one quarterback? So now you have a valuable asset.
Right.
And if you don't need it, then I think it's at least worth exploring possibly what you could get for that.
I think there's a if scenario and then a historical of why they may entertain it. The first is Kwesi Adofo-Mensah typically was looked at as, the process guy, the analytical backbone of the 49ers before he came to the Vikings. Mm-hmm. And he really kind of went against that last year. There were a lot of trades up. Dallas Turner ends up on the team, so forth and so on. And I think if there is a real urge between KOC and Kwesi to begin competing now, given the players that they have on their team, and given that they have Justin Jefferson on a contract for the next 4 years as one of the best players in the league, and some of these other guys, particularly on the defense, that are big time contributors, that you got to cash in. You got to take advantage of your window. I think that's maybe something in the historical that may show that they may be willing to trade JJ McCarthy, but it's all at the right price. If that price is like the Bryce Young price, that's one thing. If the price is not quite at that level, that's another thing. So I mean, you got to have a first round pick in there almost certainly, if not multiple second round picks. Like I don't foresee a way that a first round pick is not a part of a JJ McCarthy package.
From a timing standpoint, how does you probably want to, do you want to wait to maybe deal JJ? Do you want to wait until it's closer to the draft and we sort of know how things look, where people are going to be able to get quarterbacks, where they're not? Like, let's just time this out because you're going to have to pay Sam Darnold prior to that.
Right. I believe they have like 5 quarterbacks under contract, including JJ right now. And they also have Daniel Jones on the roster. And if that's a viable option, they think at the backup position, I think that makes a difference to a certain degree. They probably have their backup on their roster currently is the point I'm trying to make here. And so in terms of timing, I mean, you try to build demand as much as possible. I don't think there's going to be as much demand next year for a young quarterback that, in that case would have 2 years sitting down if he doesn't play, as we're kind of discussing. Mm-hmm. And so it seems like the window, if you want to make a move like that, is right now. And so it probably ends up going down to the wire, I'm sure. But I think they're in a lovely spot because I think at this point they can kind of make the Darnold decision and the McCarthy decision independent of one another, which is a spot that they were not in certainly at the beginning of the year and that they were not in, I'd say, as early as mid-season.
Do you think the fact that the rookie quarterbacks this year have had the degree of success that they have? I mean, I'm trying to think of one that just hasn't hit at all. And I can't outside of Caleb, which there's so much going on there that that jury is still out. So, but everybody else feels like they kind of got somebody in the draft.
Right.
Does that factor into the JJ stuff at all or no? It feels weird because they all came in and, where they were slotted, had a degree of success. Now Penix in Atlanta looks like that could be a guy that they can work with. Right. And so I wonder if you kind of look at JJ and think maybe him too.
It's very difficult. And I think it brings us to a broader point about the population of the mid-tier type quarterbacks in the NFL, because we're simultaneously in a spot where retread quarterbacks are starting to hit. Sam Darnold's starting to hit. Baker Mayfield's starting to hit. Jared Goff is starting to hit. Geno Smith is starting to hit. And then similarly, we just are coming out of a draft class where Bo Nix is on a playoff team, or at least something very close to a playoff team. Right. Michael Penix, as you said, is performing really well. Caleb Williams had good games and bad games. Jaden Daniels looks like a guy who could potentially make a Pro Bowl. And Drake May looks like the answer in a Patriots uniform. But just go 1 year back, and every single quarterback that was picked, Richardson, Young, and Stroud, all sub 25th in ranking in multiple different analytics. And so it's such a touch and go subject. I don't know what exactly to take away, other than you have to give these guys a little bit longer rope. And perhaps you can pick up some of these guys that weren't exactly successful year 1, year 2, year 3, put them in the right situation, and it turns out correctly, and save a couple dollars in any given year. But that's not going to hold for more than 2 years. So in terms of JJ approaching it, I think you still have to be very tentative, and unfortunately, you just have to stick to your evaluation at draft time, unless you saw something that really changed in preseason. But I wouldn't be comfortable in doing that. And obviously, most of the teams, though, teams like the Chargers already had Justin Herbert, were locked in on their guys at the time. And so unless something radically changes, I just can't see how, the Vikings would be able to get a package maybe to get him off of him. But it's the NFL. Anything can happen.
Dan B, who is watching on YouTube, wants to know if you can rank the rookie quarterbacks play this year.
JD number one. JD QB1 all the way. I will fight to the death on this. I thought he was a great player. He turned out to be. I don't think
you're gonna get a lot of arguments, at least now. And the question is specifically phrased as play this year. So I think it would be hard to put anybody ahead of Jaden in the rookie class.
Yeah.
So that one's
I
one.
I agree. I think you get to an interesting spot. I don't really know how you can watch what Drake May was able to do with virtually nothing and not feel good about that. So I'd put Drake May still probably at 2. Then it starts getting a little tricky because Caleb had really good games, and you think about it, 1-score games, field goals go another way. All of a sudden, Caleb Williams is a playoff quarterback, and Matt Eberflus probably still has a job. It's really the breaks of the game there. Bo Nix is kind of the opposite. He's on something that looks like a playoff team, but he's been burgeoned by an excellent defense, a fantastic offensive line, and he hasn't really been asked to do a ton other than not get sacked and not throw picks, which he's been able to do. So I see Bo Nix number 2. What are you doing to us, Topsky? I disagree. Drake May number 2.
What is this rolling across the bottom of the screen here? Oh, these are AI passing rankings.
I'm doing if we're ranking the play this year, I'm ranking Bo Nix over.
I think we're taking some hits here for Sammy B. Sammy B, then the B stands for bad internet connection at the moment. Are you back?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. That's wild though that Bo is 2, Caleb is 3. That they're both ahead of Drake May in terms of the AI passing grade.
Oh, AI passing grade. Yeah, I mean it's tough. Like Drake May has nothing around him. Like I feel good about him moving forward, I guess is my kind of take.
Yep. I think that's a safe take.
Since we're talking quarterbacks, to the Patriots.
I mean, I mean that would be fine. I can support that. I kind of selfishly want T. Higgins with Justin Herbert.
I can get behind that as well.
If you were because somebody else brought this up and I thought it was a really good point. Elite tight end in that Chargers offense. Like, if you have a chance to put an elite, like that specific offense, if you could put a like really high end tight end, that feels like very, very valuable there. How do you prioritize the need at wide receiver? And then if there is one staring you in the face that you could go grab that falls into that bucket at tight end, how would you prioritize that in the draft?
I'm prioritizing wide receiver. I think this is actually a pretty dense tight end draft. You have the Stars guy from Vandy. You have Tyler Warren, who's probably going to be a borderline day 2 pick from Penn State. So I'm definitely prioritizing wide receiver for their offense. I think they have 2 good tackles. I think you can go and get guys in free agency. We've seen year over year at the interior line positions. I think wide receiver needs to be something they have, and they were successful with getting Ladd McConkey this year. And I just think Justin Herbert's a great quarterback all around. The tight end position, I think, is a little deep, and I think you'll be able to, bit and piece stuff together. Will Dissly, by the metrics, was one of the better tight ends this year. I'm not saying he's elite by any measure, but you're certainly not lacking in production there, in my view.
All right, let's wrap up the quarterback conversation here by touching on the late add to the MVP conversation. Should Joe Burrow be in this mix?
So we talked about Josh Allen and Lamar this week, and I think it's a similar conversation because most valuable player, how valuable is a player to their team? And if you took that player and put him anywhere else, we have to be having these discussions alongside just what are the stats and how well have these players done with context and without context. The Bengals defense is atrocious. Joe Burrow has to score 24 plus points every single game if they want to win any game.
Yep.
that being said, he is aided by two of the best wide receivers in the league, which cannot be said of Josh Allen. And Zay Flowers, a pretty good receiver, but can't really be said of Lamar Jackson either, even though he has a lot of tight end help as well. So I think that's kind of a knock against him. And I think the other thing that you would say is fantastic for Burrow would be he's doing it at volume, but that just goes back into the defensive issue. Like they've had Chase. I thought Chase Brown has been good this year, and the reason why he's having to throw so much is because they're getting killed on the defensive side of the ball.
Right.
I think for those reasons and the reasoning that you can so clearly knock the elements that would make him the most valuable player puts Allen and Lamar ahead of them. I think as the weeks go on, it gets a little bit more interesting with Josh Allen, Lamar. I'm still on team Josh Allen. I think all three of them are fantastic picks.
I think they're all outstanding. I think you make good points that in order to put Burrow in the conversation realistically, you're comparing him to Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson, right? I'm taking Saquon out of this conversation because I can't do that. So for me, if Burrow is going to be in this conversation, that's the conversation you're having. That's the comp. Like, and maybe it's worthwhile putting him in the conversation. And people are saying like, oh, that's my, like, okay. So then we're pumping up his game and bringing attention to the fact that he's having an outstanding season. And there's obviously tons of value there. He's played great. But then you have to go back and peel back some of these numbers, and there's context for all of them, as you pointed out. The main argument for Burrow that people are going to point to are the volume stats, right? The passing yards and the touchdowns. So let's break those down. Burrow has the most passing yards. He also, because of the defense, has the most pass attempts. He has 27 more pass attempts than Patrick Mahomes, who's second in that category. We're upwards of 600 pass attempts for Joe Burrow. Per attempt, he averages 7.7 yards. That is a good number. That is the same number as Josh Allen. It's tied for 8th most. Lamar is number 1 with 8.9 yards per passing play on average. By the way, the other 3 quarterbacks who have averaged the same passing yards per play as Josh Allen and Joe Burrow, Kirk Cousins, Derek Carr, and Russell Wilson. So that's what we're doing with the pass attempts. Per pass attempt, we're taking a ton of pass attempts, right? And so we're racking up the numbers. The volume stat, once you break it down, you have to be able to break it down into like what do you do with every opportunity you have, and not just we're going to reward you because you had a million opportunities and nobody else did. So that's one argument. Passing EPA is high, 5th best in the NFL. Lamar is 1, Allen is 2. Goff and Daniels are 3 and 4. Pressure to sack rate. Joe Burrow's pressured a ton, right? He also, as you alluded to earlier, takes a lot of sacks. 20.5% of his pressures ended up as a sack. That's a pretty high number, especially compared to Josh Allen and Lamar. Josh Allen's pressure to sack rate is 8%. Lamar's is 14%. And then Josh, as something that helps him in this category, what he does when he scrambles out of those would-be sack attempts and actually picks up yards, that's another layer to this conversation that Joe Burrow's not doing because he's just taking the sack. The touchdowns, 42. We talked about the volume, so let's break that down to a touchdown per throw rate. For Burrow, it's 6%. Josh's is lower at 5%. Lamar's is 8%. Okay, now team, just offensive environment. Since week 10, most recently, when the Bengals have been like just crushing, right? Their offense ranks 6th in EPA per play, which is a good number. Like, so his, what he's doing to his environment is awesome, but the Bills are 1 and the Ravens are 2. So I think that there's lots of reason to celebrate Joe Burrow. I just think when you want to put him in a conversation with Lamar and Josh Allen, he needs to be able to beat them out. And I think the only thing that he can beat them out in is the volume stat thing. And I just think that that's a really hard argument to make in the year 2024, in my opinion.
Right. You mentioned the sack rate. Josh, I just wanted to highlight this because it's an insane stat. Josh Allen's sack rate this year is like bordering on 2%. And this is a guy that moves around quite a bit and puts himself in precarious positions quite a bit. It is a kudos to their offensive line, which I think is a strength of their team. But the dude is an absolute freak. I think what it comes down to is you have a level of production. And I think that the guys who are in the top tiers of the leagues that also had the level of production this year include Allen and include Jackson. I don't think Mahomes has the level of production this year to be the most valuable player, even though he is certainly in the top tier of guys that you can build an offensive around. And I think that Burrow has that level of production, but I don't feel like Burrow would have that level of production without Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. And so as a result, I kind of knock him down there.
Whew. We'll see who he has next year. It's going to be such. I mean, all off seasons are fascinating. It's like I like the off season as much as I like the season for so many different reasons. But there's so many different things to look forward to this year in the off season.
Yeah, I mean, we're catcalling T. Higgins to other teams over here, but man, I'd love to see him on the Bengals again. They're so fun to watch, and it's like any game we can see fantastic things from either of those guys, and they're so different. Jamar Chase and T. Higgins are that it's just lovely to watch. It's really sad. Like the Bengals' tragedy at this point is quite sad, especially if they miss the playoffs after all this effort.
I mean, we also saw just this past week a perfectly good example of why you need to have both of them on the team, because you've got Jamar Chase, and let's say they're putting, Pat Surtain on him as much as they possibly can. Then you've got T, right? Like, I mean, you've got like a 1 and a 2 that make that really, really hard to do. You can't take everything away if you have one really good lockdown corner. Yeah, I mean, we saw that with the Vikings too, right? Like the gravity of Justin Jefferson pulling the defenders, and then all of a sudden, like Naylor having a good game, and racking up the yards. And then you just have a professional quarterback who knows where to get the ball.
Right.
By the way, I need you to drop the stat that we were talking about before we came on about decision making, because I think it's super fascinating.
Right. So our decision-making statistic is based on any given play, is a quarterback targeting a player who is going to get the maximum or optimal amount of yards. The player that does that the best in the National Football League is Anthony Richardson.
What? What?
Is Anthony Richardson. The problem with this, which me and Sean Syed have dug deep into the film, we've gone to our machine learning engineers. They've built wonderful products for us to look at on like the play-by-play within the play basis, and no one can figure this out, is why his accuracy is last. And so we have T-Bills 15 saying that's obviously a flawed stat, LOL. It's not a flawed stat because the dude cannot hit the guys. He's inaccurate. And
well, he's saying the decision-making stat is the flawed stat then.
Well, he's making the right decisions.
He just can't get him the ball.
He just can't get him the ball.
That is a wild bookend of like stats, right? To be number one and last in those two things.
It's
like
very
opportunity. I'm going to give us the best opportunity to pick up yards, except that I can't.
Yeah. And again, just to clarify, this statistic is not, oh, this guy's 70 yards down the field, so he's the optimal receiver. That's not the statistic. We're using the probability that things are completed. Yeah. We're using every frame of reference. And T-Bills comes back at me with a very good thing. Probably a big Steichen influence here. That is what Sean Syed has highlighted as a big film proponent of Steichen is scheming him up in a good way. And we see that how Flacco is able to be productive despite his inefficiencies and throwing picks and stuff like that. It's just crazy that the dude cannot hit the receivers. And it's so upsetting because here's a guy who is the perfect NFL quarterback when it comes to filling out and stuff like that. And perhaps he does have a Josh Allen career down the line. A lot of his statistics are very similar to Josh Allen's through, X mini dropbacks. But man, come on, dude, complete some more passes. Like just pick up one or two here and there, maybe get warm, and then we can hit the big threes. But it's really nuts. He's like literally the second worst quarterback at volume in accuracy and one of the top quarterbacks at actually targeting the optimal receiver at any given point in time.
It tells an interesting story too, because I think, when you look at him and you're like, let's take him off the field, let's develop him. Part of that in, a lot of our minds is like, he needs time to watch tape. He needs to like figure out that part. That's usually the part that people have a hard time with. Like the game isn't slowing down for them. It's too fast. And so, but if he's making the right decisions, that tells me he's reading the field properly and that maybe that's not the issue. And it's kind of weird that the issue is not knowing where to go with the ball. I mean, maybe it has to do with timing of getting it off. How do you just not complete the pass? Like you would think that
he's
that's the
inaccurate.
starting point that is the thing that all quarterbacks should be able to do relatively easy. Like, and I know it's not easy, but I'm just saying relative to an NFL quarterback, completing the pass should be able to be the easy part. To me, the hardest part feels like when it's flying in your face and you're reading the defense and it's all going so fast, can you stand in the pocket and know where they are and still look downfield and do all of those things? So to a degree, you've got a stat there saying he kind of is doing that stuff. And then you just can't do the easy stuff. It reminds me of Dontavian Wicks, who is in many cases running beautiful routes and getting separation. And he can do all of the things that are kind of harder to find. He can do those things well. And then the ball just bounces off of his hands and he can't catch it. And you're like, you're a wide receiver. That's the easy part, you know? So I feel like the two kind of are running down parallel roads here.
No, certainly. I definitely agree. And again, the stats match up with what you're saying, Lindsay. We look at Dontavian Wicks, route running, 87th percentile, 19th best. When you look at his all-in-one metric, he's like 107th out of 141. It's a very similar. And this is why I love that we have these really detailed statistics here at SumerSports, because it allows you to dive deep into what these guys' problems are in a way that you couldn't do just looking at his EPA or how many rushes he has, or just filtering on, oh, he got this many drops on this many plays. It really allows you to get down to, no, with this guy, Dontavian Wicks, he's a great route runner. He's going to get open. We just, maybe got to throw him some bricks in the offseason, like Jerry Rice, like get those mitts nice and toasty so we can catch the ball.
That, by the way, though, for anyone who follows anyone in fantasy, it was like, why'd you tell me to draft Dontavian Wicks? These are all the reasons, because the stuff that you're like, all of this pops as like this is going to be a good guy. And then when you just can't do the easy, you can't check the easy box. It's like, I don't know what you want me to do. Like the process was correct. He's just not doing it. Like it's bizarre. So I don't know. We'll see if they can take those next steps in their development and work on those areas that need developing. Fun chat today, Sam. Next week will be very interesting and very different, I think, because as everybody knows, the first Monday after the regular season concludes, usually there are some decisions that are made pretty quickly about coaches that are not going to be retained. And so when we join you again next Tuesday, we'll have a lot of data as far as that's concerned. We'll know exactly which coaches, I think for the most part, are where the vacancies are going to be. And so we can have a conversation about which are the most attractive openings, pros, cons, all of that kind of stuff. And then maybe we can start playing matchmaker with some of the coaches that we think would fill those holes best. So that's next week on the SumerSports Show. You can catch Sam Bruchhaus every day on Sumer Daily, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Lindsay Rhodes. And thank you so much for watching. As we remind you to do every week, and as Sam has done very well throughout the show, check out the SumerSports website, SumerSports.com. There's a lot of really good advanced free data. It's not behind a paywall, so you can go look up some of these EPA numbers and some of the stuff that we're out, and there are ways to filter it. So you can follow along in that regard at SumerSports.com. We'll see you again next week.